Good morning. We're on our final week of Easter, the last day of the Easter season, the day traditionally known as Ascension Sunday. It's the day we get to think about the event from the text you just heard, Jesus taken up into heaven in front of his closest followers. And this event has become one of the central events for Christianity at large. It's one of the most celebrated special days in the church calendar. And it's also an event that became early on a central theme in the liturgy and worshipful expression of the early church. Perhaps you're familiar with the Apostles' Creed, right? It's crucial to the liturgy of many Christian traditions, and the part about Jesus basically says he was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, died, was buried, descended to hell, rose again, ascended into heaven, and is seated at the right hand of God, from whence he will come to judge the living and the dead. What's interesting is that Luke is actually the only gospel writer that tells us this event, which is kind of interesting, right? The other gospel writers do include a commissioning kind of thing, like go to the rest of the world, bring this message to people, tell them of the hope you found, or the way John says it, go love and be the presence of Christ's Spirit in the world. But only Luke includes this part about Jesus ascending into heaven. And as we begin to explore the second part of Luke's book, right, the book of Acts, he begins this second part of his account of the movement of Jesus with the text you heard read first about Jesus ascending into heaven. And then he moves pretty quickly. The next passage is a sermon that the Apostle Peter is giving in the temple. And in this sermon, we see Peter making a theological point with the ascension of Jesus. And as we begin to explore text after text in the book of Acts, we see time and time again that these sermons, these talks, these explanations of the movement of Jesus all include a reference to his ascension. Does that stand in distinction to the way you've heard the message of Jesus talked about? Most of us in here are at least in some way from evangelical backgrounds or have been exposed to it. I heard a lot of sermons, right, in my day about trying to get people to follow Jesus. It wasn't how it was talked about, but to believe in Jesus, to sign up, basically, to join the movement. And apart from those sermons, I heard a lot of other evangelistic efforts, right? Wordless books, gospel gloves, the wallet illustration. That's a niche one. Tyler's nodding. And every time I heard one of these, oh, here's another one, the Netcasters curriculum. I don't know if any of you ever went through that. My dad was big into Netcasters. We had all these different tools, right, that were meant to kind of quickly explain the work of Jesus and then call for someone to sign up, to believe, to say a prayer, to seal the deal with a conversion statement. And in all of that, right, all those tools, I never actually heard the idea of Jesus ascending to heaven playing any kind of central role in that. Was that your experience? Like, did you hear that the most important thing was Jesus' death? That's what I always heard. In the gospel glove, there was no finger for ascension, right? You'd have to maybe like do something like this. In the wordless book, there was no page for ascension. Somehow, this thing that was central to the early believers actually got lost. And I think it's really important to see this because I think that forms of Christianity that view conversion as some sort of transactionary event have really missed out on what was going on in the early church. And that's not to say that I'm trying to reclaim the early church. Like, I don't like when people talk like that, right? We're not trying to, like, go back to a golden age. But we do need to reclaim the core value of the early church, the value of movement. Not protecting something in the past, but rather being open to new possibilities. If there's anything we can learn from them, it was that. Always listening and being open to what was next. So I don't mean when I say that like we're missing what the early church had, that we should go back to the way they did things or something like that, but I mean looking at the core of what was happening. Because the way early Christians were thinking about Jesus led them to view the world in really interesting ways. And if we can reclaim that commitment, I think what will grow will be new expressions of good in our world, just as they saw new expressions growing around them. So what did the ascension mean for those early believers, those early followers, and why was it important? To answer that question, we're going to explore the background, historical context of the idea of ascension, and then we'll look at that second reading you heard read about Paul and Silas in Philippi, and we'll let it inform how ascension guided the early followers in practical and tangible ways. And then hopefully we can connect that to ways that we can be guided by ascension in practical ways as well. Make sense? All right, here we go. The idea of someone taken up into heaven was not actually a new idea. In the Hebrew Scriptures, we've seen it a couple times. If you remember the guy, Enoch, says he was taken by God. A little short thing. But then we see the story of Elijah. It's kind of more unpacked. Elijah, the prophet, is walking with his understudy, Elisha. Very confusing. And they're walking together, talking, discussing things, and suddenly, chariots of fire come out of the sky. And a huge pillar of fire, shoots down and, separates the two of them. And Elisha falls back, and he's looking at this pillar of fire and realizes that Elijah has been caught up within it, like a tornado of flames. And he's calling out, Elijah, Elijah. Then he disappears. The only thing left is his outer garment, his mantle, and then when Elisha takes it up, he's become the new prophet, right? He walks back to the camp where the prophets are staying, and they say, wow, the spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha. Does that sound pretty similar to what's going on with Ascension? There's just elements that the apostles are drawing on here, right? Jesus ascends, and now what? His spirit rests on his followers, and they are to be his presence in the world. There's definitely some parallels. The idea in Jewish thought is if someone's taken up into heaven without dying, it's a sense of divine approval, right? It's this kind of final yes to their life and their mission. We've already seen this sense of divine approval through resurrection, right? It's this idea that Jesus is killed and God is saying, no, empire, Jewish religious leaders, you don't get to win. You can't destroy what Jesus is about. No to the death-dealing interests of the way things are, and a giant yes to the way of Jesus. The Roman context was also no stranger to ascension. Right? So Julius Caesar, upon his death, was said to have ascended to heaven and had divinity bestowed upon him. This story really helped to undergird the imperial cult of Rome, where it was said that the emperors ruled as gods by divine right, and each followed Julius, his path at their own deaths, becoming divinized as he had become. These stories helped in the machine of Rome, right? It makes sense for your emperors to be divine if you're claiming to be an eternally lasting empire. And this is, of course, what oftentimes got the early church into trouble, right? It wasn't their theology, it wasn't their beliefs. Rome was very tolerant of all kinds of different religions. You could believe, practice basically whatever you wanted. But what they didn't want was subversion. The earlier followers of Jesus, time and time again, got into trouble, not for leaving paganism, but for refusing to recognize the emperor as divine, for refusing to offer sacrifices in the imperial cult, for refusing to basically pledge their allegiance to Rome. And this is what ascension is all about. It's the idea that no king, no power, no empire stands above Jesus. This was the message preached early on, time and time again. And it's definitely one that has been lost over time. So put one of the early sermons from the apostles in this context. Paul says at one point in Romans 10, if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That's a pretty common construction in the New Testament, isn't it? We heard something similar in the second text. Believe on the Lord Jesus and you will be saved. But let's put that in the context that we've built here. Let's see it from the context of Rome, specifically ascension and divine emperors. Confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord. Say out loud, Jesus is Lord. What does that mean? Well, it literally would preclude a person from saying that Caesar is Lord. A title that was commonly used for the emperor long before it was ever used for Jesus. If you believe in your heart that he was raised from the dead, what is this? Like, you just got to believe it because Paul said you have to? It's some box you have to check? No, it's that commitment, again, to holding fiercely to the idea that his way of life, justice, peace, rightness, equity, love are divinely approved over and against the might is right, the greed is good, any other common ways of ruling then and now. You will be saved. What does that mean? God's going to like you again when he didn't? No. After Julius Caesar was deified, the title Son of God went to his son, Caesar Augustus, right? If Julius Caesar became a god when he died, then his currently ruling son would be Son of God. He was also given the title Savior of the world. Why? Because Rome brought peace to tribal regions. Rome brought prosperity and trade to the world's poor. Rome brought civility to barbarity. Rome brought learning to the uneducated. Rome, the eternal empire led by God's Son, saved the world through its efforts. And yet, time and time again, we see stories of the neglected, examples of the exploited, the murdered, all in the name of salvation and the world's peace. So if you want to paraphrase Paul's words from Romans chapter 10, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You could just say, pledge allegiance to Jesus and not to Caesar. That's what belief is in the New Testament. Now, that's why this confession of Jesus as Lord is always central to their speaking. That's why ascension is always a central part of the telling of Jesus. So, of course, if you lose all of that context, you're going to lose ascension because it doesn't quite make sense otherwise, does it? It's going to get left out of our telling. The kind of commitment to the way of Jesus over and against Rome's imperial peace is put on full display many times in the New Testament. We see it in a very stark way from the story you just read from Acts 16. Paul and Silas are in Philippi. As we saw last week, right, they met this group of women at Philippi, one of them Lydia, who just resonated so strongly with what Paul is saying, wanted in, joined the movement, begged Paul and Silas to stay at her house, so they did. So now they're walking through the city, right? Extended the stay a little longer than they thought, probably trying to talk to people in the marketplace, hear some new ideas. And Luke says that this girl who has a spirit of divination is following them around, saying, These are servants of the Most High God. Listen to what they say. And Paul gets annoyed, gets frustrated, irritated. Why? I don't know. But here's what I think it is. Does Paul believe that about himself? Does he believe he's serving God? Sure, yeah, of course. But have you ever been in a situation like this, personally? I think I know what Paul's feeling here. This has happened to me several times where I'll be talking to a group of people, talking about life's big issues, right? Maybe talking about religion, talking about politics, all things you're not supposed to talk about with strangers. And we'll be conversing, sharing ideas, and someone in the group who knows me will say to someone else in the group who doesn't know me, oh yeah, he's a pastor. Nothing kills the mood faster than that. I am telling you. People have all of this baggage with that word, all of these ideas. And every time someone says, oh yeah, he's a pastor, I'm always like, yeah, but so can we just talk about what we were talking about before you said that? Please don't let that taint the good things we've been saying, because there's all these assumptions about that word. So maybe Paul felt something like that, right? Hey, slave girl with a divinizing spirit, you're giving the wrong idea to people. It kind of makes you look crazy, doesn't it, if a crazy acting person is following you around screaming that you're God's servants? It kind of illegitimizes what you're doing. Whatever the reason, Paul's upset. We know Paul's propensity for coarse language and rash actions. So he turns around and he heals this girl, right? In some manner of speaking, her spirit that gave her the ability to speak these things is now done, finished. Whatever's happening here, it's what comes next that's really meant to grab our attention. Right? This is just this inciting incident. Whatever happened in the interaction between Paul and the slave girl, she is no longer able to do this fortune-telling thing that brought her slave owners money. And this makes them, of course, furious. And in an amazingly timely, I guess universal, course of action, we see them following this path. When their opportunity, right, to gain wealth through exploitation is gone, they resort to appeals to cultural purity. Right? They go to the local authorities and they say, first of all, they don't say he took away our livelihood. They may not have had a leg to stand on. Who knows what this slave girl had going on? They don't even deal with that. They're upset because of that. But then they go to the magistrates and they say, these men are Jews. They're not like us. They're giving customs that are not lawful for Romans to abide by. They're changing our way of life. They're corrupting our way of life. We don't even know if this is true in this case. We do know that Paul did advocate for some things, specifically in the way that women were accepted into the community, that were illegal in ancient Rome. But there's no evidence of that happening right now. This is the second time we see in Philippi Paul reaching out to people in some way, or creating a scenario at least, where people who are not typically even viewed now come into the scene. Last week, women outside the city to pray. This week, a slave girl. Whatever was going on, the authorities agree. So they beat them and throw them in jail. But, and this is what makes this story so applicable to this season, in classic resurrection style, a giant earthquake comes, a giant no to empire, a giant no to appeals to cultural purity, and a giant yes to true peace opens the doors, knocks everyone's shackles off. It's really interesting to note here that Luke says all the doors were opened and all the shackles fell off. Right? Not just Paul and Silas's, not just like the good guys. All the other prisoners are free to go, potentially. Maybe they were all political prisoners, like Paul and Silas. Maybe they were all outsiders who corrupted the Roman way of life. Maybe they were other slave girls who had ceased to be profitable. Maybe they were young men with overly harsh drug sentences. But whatever the case, this angelic earthquake gives everyone the chance to escape. And the guard pulls out his sword immediately to kill himself. Because apparently, under the peace of the eternal empire, what happens to you when prisoners escape through no fault of your own is a fate worse than death. But Paul's like, whoa, buddy. We're all still here. Put the sword away. No one's gone. It's pretty nice. They'd rather he live than die. They'll willingly give up their freedom so that he doesn't kill himself or bring harm to himself. And then Paul sees in this moment, in addition to the physical doors being open, this metaphorical door wide open. And he tells the jailer, hey, what you got going on now, right? The people you work for that were probably going to torture you and your family or whatever. There's something more. There's something better. You join us, who care about even our captors. You can join us, who care about what happens to some slave girl. There's another way to bring peace, real peace. How? Believe on the Lord Jesus. Do you want salvation? The salvation you've heard promised countless times to be truly in front of you? Pledge allegiance to the new kingdom, under a loving emperor, under a just and right way of life. So the jailer, of course, wants in. He jumps ship. Of course he does. He's seen Paul and Silas stand up to the greedy. He's seen them proclaim peace. He's heard them singing songs of praise while they're in prison. And now he's seen them care even for him, their captor. It's hard to escape that kind of love. I don't know all that happened in the city of Philippi after Paul and Silas left, but we do know that a community of the new humanity sprung up there. Paul wrote to them, and we're lucky to have that letter to the Philippians. At the end of that letter, Paul says to them, they were the most generous community in the region of Macedonia. They're always there to take care of him. They've always got his back. Maybe the jailer is in that group. Maybe Lydia's there. And then he says something really interesting. At the very end of the book, he says, all the saints greet you. Right? He's listing all the people there saying hi, saying people are praying for them. He says, all the saints greet you, but especially those from the household of the emperor. It's a pretty cool little statement that gets overlooked sometimes. This new movement, right, this like ragtag, subversive, fake empire built on an ascended Lord who preached love, is somehow making its way into the very household, the very servant class of the emperor himself. It's crazy. Slaves working for the emperor who held no kind of ultimate allegiance for him, who worked lovingly and presumably quietly for the good of those around them in the name of a different kingdom. And secondly, they made a point to tell Paul, oh, you're writing to the Philippians? Hey, tell them that we're thinking about them. We know it's hard there. We know it's tough. We know that those calls to culture of purity can easily turn against those believers. We know it's easy to be imprisoned there. This was the mentality of the early church, right? They were a movement. They were fairly coordinated. They cared about others in their movement. They viewed themselves in a war. Not against flesh and blood, as Paul says, right? Not against individual people. Not against people who weren't like them. Not against people who didn't agree with them or whatever. Not a war of violence. But a war nonetheless. A war of love versus hate. A war of peace through love versus peace through power. A war of giving against greed. A war of generosity against clutching. That's the mentality that keeps Ascension in a central place. It's one that we must embrace for ourselves. Rome's gone, right? Many years ago. But the spirit of empire is by no means dead. Right? And sadly, oftentimes as Christians, we trade an ascended Lord for a physical one in just a short time. The early church traded their ascended Lord for new divine Christian Roman emperors. And once again, might made right. Exploiting slaves still exists, right? It didn't end in Philippi. Inhumane prisons still exist. It didn't end with Philippi. Calls for cultural purity still exist. It didn't end in Philippi. Everything that Paul and Silas came up against in Acts 16 is still up against us today. That's just the truth. So we must cling to an ascended Lord and to his way of ruling if we ever truly want to see salvation for ourselves or our world. I want to end with a quote from N.T. Wright because I think it really helps sum up what we're trying to embrace when we celebrate Ascension Sunday. He says, "This is what it looks like when Jesus is running the world. The meek will be taking over the earth. So gently the powerful won't even notice until it's too late. The peacemakers will be putting the arms manufacturers out of business. Those who are hungry and thirsty for God's justice will be analyzing government policy and speaking up for those at the bottom of the pile. The merciful will show there's a different way to do human relations other than being judgmental, eager to put everyone else down. You are the light of the world," Jesus says. May that quote describe our lives and describe the life of our church. Let's pray.